President Joe Biden is in Brussels tonight ahead of another busy week of diplomacy, beginning with the NATO summit and including a face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Told NBC News he believes relations between the countries are at their worst ever. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken tells NBC's Andrea Mitchell he's optimistic about America's place in the world.
This meeting with President Putin is not happening in a vacuum. President Biden will be coming off a very successful summit of the G7, a NATO summit, a meeting with the EU's leaders. And these democratic alliances are an incredible source of strength for us, a unique asset that Russia doesn't enjoy, China doesn't enjoy. And we're finding that we are able to bring them together effectively, diplomatically, politically, economically, militarily. And that's a very strong foundation upon which to engage the challenges posed by Russia or China or anyone else for that matter.
Joining me now is Hagar Chemali. She's the host of YouTube series Oh My World, the former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, and the former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. Hagar, thank you so much for joining me. My first question to you is, here is what Biden had to say in advance of his meeting. What should we make of it? Take a listen.
The best way to deal with this is for he and I to meet, he and I to have our discussion. I know you don't doubt that I'll be very straightforward with him about our concerns.
Why do you think he hasn't changed his behavior in spite of everything the U.S. has done to this point?
He's Vladimir Putin.
How much tension should we expect in these meetings, Hagar?
Listen, it's definitely going to be tense, right? And I mean, President Biden has said that he is going to let Putin know what he wants him to know, right? Those were his exact words at his speech on Friday. And I expect him to be straightforward with him and say, this is the type of behavior we're not going to tolerate. We're not going to tolerate you interfering in our elections, in allowing hackers to hack our government and to pursue ransomware attacks on our companies and our infrastructure. We're not going to allow you to interfere in Ukraine and in Syria this way. So I do expect him to be straight, but I also expect him to tell him, by the way, these are the things we want to work on, right? We want to work on the Iran deal. We want to work on arms control. So he has said, and Secretary of State Blinken has said that the goal is to create this kind of stable relationship through which they can have this dialogue and these conversations. And that is very important. But it is going to be tense. And I do believe that is why President Biden has said that he does not want to do a press conference with President Putin. I think it's because he doesn't want that tension, and he doesn't want the public and the press harping on details and signs that would hype that tension up.
Hagar, is it that they don't want the tension, or is it that Biden is trying to put Putin in his place, saying that they are not on level ground, given all of the potential nefarious activity that Russia seems to be behind? And when I say this, I'm talking about the potential ransomware incidences, the hacking that we're seeing, and the list goes on.
That could certainly be it. I mean, of course, when I was at the White House, we used to view things in that light, and you definitely see it with this administration, right? For example, that's how they've approached Saudi Arabia and not dealing with the Crown Prince, right? They don't view the Crown Prince on the level of President Biden, which is completely true and completely fair. So it could be that, but in their words, President Biden has said that he doesn't want the press focusing on details that could undermine his key message or could make it seem as though that could weaken his points. And I understand what he means. What he means is that he is probably a little bit concerned that this is the very first meeting the two of them will have since Biden is president, and following 4 years where we had a previous president who really did not stand up to President Putin, and communications really do matter. Even though President Trump did impose sanctions, public communications and private communications matter heavily. And so I think President Biden doesn't want to distract from his message. Now, there are pros and cons to this. The pro is that on one hand, there is some control that they can have there because the press conference may not run out of their hands. But on the flip side, the Russians are master manipulators, and they're going to go tell the world what went on in the meeting, even if not all of it was true. And then the White House will be left chasing that message. So that is going to be a little bit frustrating. But we have to remember this is going to be the first step in many to try and increase the pressure on Russia and tell them flat out what we will and won't accept.
So, Hager, NBC's own Keir Simons had a chance to sit down with Putin. Take a listen, and I'd love your reaction.
When President Biden was asked whether he believes you are a killer, he said, I do. Mr. President, are you a killer?
Over my tenure, I've gotten used to attacks from all kinds of angles and from all kinds of areas under all kinds of pretext and reasons, and of different caliber and fierceness, and none of it surprises me. So as far as harsh rhetoric, I think that this is an expression of overall U.S. culture.
So this is a very different tactic under Trump. Under Trump, basically, when similar questions were asked of Donald Trump, he basically said that we have to look at ourselves before we point over to Russia. This is a complete reversal. Biden is being very clear of what he thinks of Putin, and Putin is trying to deflect. How is Putin's strategy walking in now that it's clearly going to be a bit tense? What is he thinking?
I expect President Putin to deny absolutely everything that Biden throws his way, right? So the meeting itself may not be very productive because you're going to have Biden say, don't hack our government, don't interfere in our elections, don't interfere, anywhere, don't allow hackers to pursue ransomware attacks. And Putin is going to smirk the way he did in the interview with Keir Simons and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not who we are. If you really want to pursue positive relations, this is not the way to deal with me, right? He's going to be difficult and he's going to be a little insecure, right? As Secretary of State Blinken said, Biden will be coming off these meetings from the G7 and the NATO summit. And NATO is the biggest thorn in Putin's side. He hates NATO and it's his biggest threat. And the reason for that is that NATO continues to grow and it continues to accept countries as members that run up to Russia's border. And it was one of the things that really concerned us, by the way, when former President Trump used to say, well, I don't know about NATO. We were concerned that he was getting that talking point from Putin himself. So Biden is going to come into this meeting very strategically in Switzerland on neutral ground and go in there with having had these meetings, having it look as though, all these countries are behind him. It's a unified front. So that will shake Putin a little bit. So even if the meeting seems not productive, which I expect it to be, it is one step in twisting Putin's arm a little bit to say, we're not alone in this. We've got all of these folks behind us and we're not going to rest, right? This is just the beginning of the Biden administration and their efforts to rally an international coalition to object to Russia's nefarious behavior.
So here, I want to underscore something that you mentioned. One of the biggest challenges that America and the NATO countries have with Russia specifically is that this idea of cybersecurity and cyber interference is kind of like a pinky swear. I'm not going to do it. But there's no real type of repercussions in the event that some nation does that to a country. What do we have at our disposal? What tools do we have at our disposal to enforce this pinky swear so that when ransomware does run amok, that there are consequences for folks such as the Russian government?
I am so glad you asked this question because it is a really tough one, and I lived it when I was in the government, and it's a difficult one. It's a tough nut to crack. I happen to come from the sanctions world. I worked at the Treasury Department for a very long time, and when I was at Treasury, there were executive orders that had developed to sanction those engaged in what was called malign cyber activity. So to encompass a range of cyber-related issues. And even at Treasury, we knew that this wasn't the silver bullet, that this may not be the best way, but we were trying to figure it out at the time. And so you've seen the government do that since, right? It continued under former President Trump and Biden to sanction those types of actors. What needs to happen at the end of the day is what would be preferable is an international body taking that responsibility and not just having it be unilateral from the United States.
Hager Chemali, thank you for all of that enlightenment today. Thanks for being with us.